Montana Territory, June 1883. Mud clung to the hem of her skirt as Margaret Mae Murphy stepped off the rickety stagecoach. Her baby pressed tight against her chest, and her world held together by a single envelope that would never be answered. The wind kicked up dust along the main street of Dry Creek, a town too small for promises and too quiet for the hopes she had carried from Missouri. The depot was empty save for a sleeping dog and an old man sweeping the steps of the mercantile. There was no man waiting with a smile and open arms. No groom, only silence and the weight of a letter she had read 100 times. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the baby, brushing a kiss against the top of her daughter's downy head. "I tried." The baby Hazel blinked up at her, unbothered by the world unraveling around them. Margaret had answered the ad in December. A widower, honest and God-fearing, seeking a wife to help raise his 2 sons and keep a home. She had written back with trembling hands, told the truth about the baby in her belly and the man who'd left her behind without a name. The widower replied anyway. Said God forgives and he needed a good woman more than he needed a spotless past. Only he wasn't here. She stood alone on the boardwalk, holding the child he had agreed to raise, the child he now would never meet. "You lost." The voice was low, steady. A man's boots stepped into her field of vision, stopping a few feet away. Margaret looked up, squinting through the sunlight. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a worn hat pulled low over dark hair and a rifle slung across his back. Dust streaked his coat and his eyes were the color of river stone, cool, steady, and watching her quiet. "I was supposed to meet someone," she said, her voice barely a breath. "But he's not here, I think he changed his mind." The cowboy glanced at the empty street. "You his kin?" "No." "I was to be his wife." Her cheeks burned. "Mail order." The baby let out a soft sound, curling her small fist against Margaret's chest. The man shifted his weight. "You came all this way with a baby and no one met you?" "No one," she swallowed. "We have nowhere to go." He hesitated, then stepped closer. "What's your name, ma'am?" "Margaret Murphy," she said, straightening her spine. "This is my daughter, Hazel." The cowboy tipped his hat, eyes flicking to the child. "My name's Asa O'Rourke. I've got a cabin about 5 miles west. You and the baby can come rest there tonight. There's no hotel in town and I won't leave you out here alone." Margaret looked down at Hazel, then back at the road, then to the man with the steady eyes. "I don't know you." "No, ma'am," he said gently. "You don't, but I swear I won't harm you." "I was raised better than that." Something in his tone softened her. Honest, firm, like a man who carried the weight of his word. "All right," she said, her voice trembling. "Just for the night." Asa led them to his horse, a thick-coated bay with a calm nature. He tied his saddlebag tighter and looked to Margaret. "You can ride, I'll walk." She shook her head. "I can walk." "You're holding a baby," he said. "Ride." She climbed up awkwardly, one hand clutching Hazel, the other gripping the horn. Asa took the reins and started down the trail toward the hills, boots crunching dry grass. They did not speak for a long while. The land opened wide around them, pine trees dotting the horizon and the sun dipping low, casting long shadows behind them. "How long have you lived out here?" she asked. 3 years, he said. "Since my brother died, I took over the land." She didn't ask how his brother died. His voice made clear it wasn't a thing he liked to remember. "What about you?" he asked. "Where's your family?" "Gone," she said. "My father died of fever. My mother passed in childbirth. My sister married and moved to Kansas. I was working at a boarding house when I found out I was expecting." He nodded, no judgment in his face. "You said the man left?" he asked. He didn't even wait to hear I was with child, just disappeared. Her voice cracked. Asa didn't say anything. But his hand tightened slightly on the reins. They reached the cabin just as the sky turned orange. It was small, one room, a stove in the corner, a cot and a table with 2 chairs but clean and warm. Asa lit a lantern, then dragged a chair near the fire. "You can take the bed," he said. "I could sleep on the floor." "You won't," he said. "Not with a baby." Margaret laid Hazel down on the bed, wrapped in a quilt Asa fetched from a chest. The baby sighed in her sleep. Asa handed Margaret a tin plate with bread and warm beans. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded and sat in the chair, eating in silence. When she finished, she looked at him across the fire. "You didn't have to bring us here. You do not even know me." I know what it looks like when someone's been left behind, he said quietly. I was 10 when our father walked out for good. My mother raised me and my brother on dried beans and stubbornness. She never let anyone see her cry. Margaret blinked, her throat thick. I'm not looking for charity, she said. I'm not offering any, he replied. Then softer, but I could offer something else. She looked at him, her heart suddenly loud in her chest. I have land, a roof, no one waiting on me. You and Hazel need more than a place to sleep. If you want it, I could give you my name. She stared at him, stunned. You do not even know me. I know enough. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I know what it means to be left with nothing, and I know what it means to build something from it. I would not ask you to love me today, but I would give you my name. And I would raise that child like she's my own. Her breath caught. He stood then, slow and calm, and walked to the door, giving her space. I will sleep in the barn, he said. You and Hazel will be safe here. Asa, she said suddenly, standing. He turned. I do not need time to think, he blinked. You were the only one who saw me standing there and did not look away. She crossed the room, stopping in front of him. You offered your name to a woman and child who had nothing. That tells me everything I need to know. He looked at her, quiet. I will marry you, she said. His jaw flexed, but his eyes went soft. Then I will take care of you both, he said. And for the first time since she had left Missouri, Margaret felt the ground steady beneath her feet. They were married the next morning, beneath a sky the color of ash and the hush of pine trees bowing in the wind. Asa rode into Dry Creek at first light, returning with Reverend Paulson and a pair of silver rings that had belonged to his mother. Margaret held Hazel close against her chest as the vows were spoken, the baby's breath warm through the muslin wrap. The words were simple, the promises quiet, but when Asa looked at her and said, I will stand beside you, Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her again, this time in a way that steadied. After the preacher left, Asa didn't press her about anything. He went about hauling water from the creek, chopping wood for the stove, and letting her decide how much of the cabin she wanted to make hers. Margaret unpacked slowly, laying out what little she owned. A spare dress, a pair of worn boots, a tin of lye soap. She placed Hazel's knitted cap on the shelf above the bed and folded the baby's swaddling cloths with care. By late afternoon, Asa returned from the barn with a cradle in his arms. The wood was worn but polished, the joints tight and sturdy. My brother made it, he said, setting it beside the bed. He carved the edges when his first boy was born, thought Hazel might sleep easier in something just her size. Margaret ran her fingers along the smoothed pine. Thank you. I'll sleep in the loft tonight, he said, nodding toward the ladder tucked near the back wall. She looked up. The low platform was just big enough for a bedroll and a blanket. You don't have to do that. I know. She tucked Hazel into the cradle, watching as her daughter's eyes fluttered closed. Then she stood slowly, brushing her palms against her skirt. I never imagined it'd be like this, she said. He glanced over from the stove where he was stirring something thick and savory. Like what? Quiet, she said. Kind. Asa didn't answer, just ladled stew into 2 bowls and set them on the table. She sat across from him, the candle between them flickering in the draft. You ever been married before? She asked. He shook his head. Came close once. Her name was Eliza. She moved back east after her father died. Did you love her? He stirred his spoon through the broth. I think I would have, given the chance. Margaret folded her hands around the tin bowl. It's strange, isn't it, how people drift in and out of your life like weather. Asa glanced toward Hazel, who was sleeping with one tiny hand curled near her mouth. Some stay. She followed his gaze, her chest tightening. I want her to have a home where the walls don't feel borrowed. She will, he said. If you're willing, we'll build one together. She nodded, the promise settling in her bones like warmth. I'd like to help with the animals tomorrow. There's only 1 milk cow and a few hens, he said. But I'd be glad for the company. After the dishes were washed and dried, Asa climbed the ladder with a blanket under one arm and a lantern in the other. Margaret stood near the fire, unsure whether to stay up or crawl into bed. Hazel stirred once, then settled again. You ever see your father again? She asked, her voice just above a whisper. No, Asa said from the loft. He left with a rifle and $2. My brother and I figured the river took him. She looked into the flames. I used to think people like that were born hard. But maybe they just gave up too early. There was a pause. Maybe, Asa said, but we didn't. The wind shifted outside, brushing against the cabin with a low sigh. She blew out the candle and crawled into bed beside Hazel, the cradle close enough to reach. The mattress was firmer than she was used to, but it smelled of cedar and clean cotton. Asa didn't speak again that night. But long after the fire burned down to embers, Margaret lay awake listening to the soft creak of wood above her. The sound of a man who hadn't run. She closed her eyes, her hand resting near Hazel's arm, and let herself believe for the first time in months that they'd been found instead of lost. The first frost came early that year. Asa found her standing by the fence line just after sunrise, a shawl over her shoulders and her hands tucked beneath her arms. Hazel was asleep inside, swaddled close to Margaret's chest. The morning light broke through the pines, catching in her hair, which she hadn't yet pinned up. He slowed his steps so as not to startle her. "You'll catch cold without gloves," he said. She turned slightly, her breath visible in the air. "I wanted to see the frost before it melted." He slipped his hands into his coat pockets. "Not much to look at, really. Just the land cooling off." "It's more than that," she said. "It's the earth learning how to sleep." Asa looked out past the fence, where the grass wore a silver edge and the sky stretched pale and clear. "Never thought of it that way." They stood for a moment longer, the wind still. Hazel stirred once, then settled. "Do you always get this quiet when the weather turns?" she asked. "I get quieter when I've got something to think over." She looked at him carefully. "And do you now?" He nodded. "I need to bring the cattle down to the lower pasture before the ground gets too hard. Won't be easy with just me." "I can help," she said. "If you let me ride." He raised an eyebrow. "You ride?" "Not well," she admitted, "but I've done it. I've got an old mule that's steady on hills." "She's slow, but she won't spill you." Margaret gave a nod. "Then I'll take her." Later that morning, he saddled the mule and helped her mount. Hazel stayed inside, watched over by a neighbor woman Asa had paid with a sack of flour and a promise to mend her fence. Margaret wore a second shawl and rode stiff-backed, but she didn't complain, even when the trail narrowed through a patch of brush that clawed at her skirt. Asa watched her out of the corner of his eye, her hands tight on the reins but her jaw set like stone. When they reached the ridge, the land fell away into a bowl of dry grass and clustered trees. The cattle moved below, dark shapes against the pale slope. "Will they move easy?" she asked. "Most'll follow feed. A few always test their luck." He handed her a length of rope. "If one breaks off, you hold this tight and head it back. Don't chase it, just block the path." She nodded, taking the rope. They worked for hours, the sun climbing overhead and the air warming just enough to shake the frost loose. Margaret didn't speak much, but she didn't fall behind either. Her cheeks pinked from wind, and once when a steer turned too sharp, she clicked her tongue and swung the rope wide without flinching. By mid-afternoon, the herd was penned in the lower field. Asa leaned against the gate, wiping sweat from his brow. "You did better than most ranch hands I've had." "I didn't do anything special," she said. "You stayed on your mount, didn't cry out, and didn't quit. That counts." She looked down at her gloved hands. "I used to think strength was loud." "It isn't," he said. "It's quiet as bone." Margaret dismounted, her legs stiff. "I was never taught work like this. I was taught to sew and pour coffee without spilling a drop." "You can learn anything," he said. "You already are." They walked back to the cabin, the mule trailing behind them. The wind picked up again, rattling the dry weeds that lined the path. Asa glanced at her. "You ever think about what you want, not just what you'll accept?" She looked ahead. "I used to want a house with lace curtains and a porch swing. A man who sat beside me after supper. And now, I want the girl I'm raising to grow up knowing she belongs." Asa was quiet for a stretch, the only sound their boots against the packed dirt. "She does," he said. When they reached the cabin, Hazel was fussing. Margaret took her in her arms, rocking gently by the stove. Asa watched her for a moment, then stepped outside without a word. When he returned, he carried something wrapped in canvas. "I've been meaning to fix this up," he said, unrolling it on the table. "Found it in the loft. My brother's old rocker." The wood was scratched and partly split, but the shape was still there. He knelt beside it, running a hand along the frame. I can sand it down, replace what's rotted. She stepped forward. For me, for you and Hazel. Thought she might sleep easier if you had a place to sit with her. I'd like that, she said. He looked up at her, his hands still on the wood. I never thought I'd be building something that mattered. You are, she said. They didn't speak again for a while. Outside, the sky deepened to slate. Inside, the fire crackled low and Hazel dozed against her mother's chest. Asa reached for the tools and Margaret brought the lamp closer. Together they worked. The first snow came in the night. Margaret woke to the hush of it, thick and soundless, falling steady beyond the frost-laced window. Hazel stirred beside her, nestled warm in the cradle Asa had mended. The rocker sat nearby, newly finished, its curved rails smooth beneath her hand when she rose to sit with the baby. She wrapped Hazel in the quilt Asa's mother had made, the one with the sun-stitched corners, and rocked until the child's breath fell into rhythm with the wind outside. Asa was already outside when she stepped onto the porch. Snow clung to his shoulders and the brim of his hat, and he was driving stakes into the ground near the shed, his breath fogging in the cold. "What are you building?" Margaret asked, Hazel bundled tight against her chest. He looked up, hammer still in hand. "Smokehouse." "Won't make it through winter on beans and flour." She stepped down carefully. "What will we dry?" "Venison, mostly. Maybe elk if I can find one before the snow deepens." She watched the steady motion of his arm as he drove the next stake. "Do you hunt alone?" "I take my time." "Listen more than I move." She shifted Hazel's weight gently. "You think you could teach me?" Asa straightened. "You want to learn to shoot. I want to know how to fill a pot if you're gone longer than expected." He considered that a moment, then nodded. "I'll start with a rifle you can manage. We'll go after the next storm clears." She didn't say anything else, just stood there in the quiet, watching him work. When he paused to drink from the tin flask on his belt, she reached up without thinking and brushed a line of snow from his collar. His breath hitched, just barely, but he didn't pull away. That evening, Margaret cooked while Asa carved. He had taken to whittling near the hearth after supper, shaping things slowly with a jackknife and a steady hand. Tonight it was a bird, a grouse, she thought, from the curve of the neck. Hazel lay on a blanket near the stove, fists waving sleepily at the ceiling. Margaret ladled stew into bowls and set them on the table. "I saw your hands shaking a little when you came in earlier. Old break in the wrist, split it falling off a bronc when I was 20. Cold brings it back." She sat across from him, tearing off a piece of bread. "You ever think about leaving this place?" He chewed slowly, then shook his head. "I've been across the Dakotas, rode through Nebraska, Kansas, parts of Wyoming, always came back here." "Why?" He glanced toward the window. "Because the land doesn't ask for more than I've got, just wants you honest and steady." Margaret smiled faintly. "Sounds like someone I married." He met her eyes then, the flicker of firelight softening the lines around his mouth. "You regret it yet?" "No," she said. "I just didn't expect peace to feel so unfamiliar." Hazel let out a soft cry, and Margaret rose to gather her. As she rocked the child against her shoulder, Asa stood and crossed the room. He reached out, hesitated, then touched Hazel's back with the flat of his palm. "She's getting heavier," he said. "She eats like a farmhand." He chuckled low in his throat. "She's got fight in her, like her mother." Margaret looked up at him, the sound of the fire soft behind them. "I didn't know what to expect when I stepped off that coach. But I didn't expect to feel safe." "You are," he said. Hazel settled again, her head tucked beneath Margaret's chin. "I've been thinking," Asa said, voice quieter now, "about building a second room on the cabin. Come spring, might give Hazel space to grow. Give you more light for your sewing, too." Her eyes warmed. "You already plan that far ahead," he nodded. "Can't plant a thing without seeing it grown in your mind first." She stepped a little closer. "You see us then?" "Grown, I do." She watched him a long moment, then leaned into him, not a kiss, not yet, but her shoulder against his chest, her hand resting against the hollow of his arm. He didn't move, just stood there with her, solid and sure. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the warmth held. The wind shifted west by mid-December, carrying the bite of river ice and the faint scent of pine smoke from cabins tucked deep in the hills. Margaret stood by the work table, stitching a lining into a winter bonnet she was making for Hazel. now 6 months old and crowing each morning with a voice that had found its strength. Asa was mending harness leather at the far end of the room, his hands steady even as the fire popped behind him. "You've got away with your fingers," she said, not looking up. "I'd have expected more fumbling from a man who hadn't sewn lace in his life." He grinned without lifting his eyes. "This ain't lace, it's rawhide, different rules." She tied off her thread and set the needle down. "Still. That patch you did last week on my boot held better than the original." Asa set the leather aside and washed his hands in the basin near the door. "I learned early, Ma didn't believe in waste. If something tore, we fixed it, didn't matter if it was a shirt or a saddlebag." Margaret folded the finished bonnet and placed it in the chest near the bed. "You ever think of her when you work?" He dried his hands on a cloth and leaned against the post. "More than I let on. She was quiet, but she had a way of seeing through you. When she got sick, I thought I'd be ready, but I wasn't." Margaret turned toward him. "What took her? Winter fever. She was gone before the thaw. My brother never quite walked right after that." She stepped closer, her voice soft. "What about you?" His gaze drifted to Hazel, who was batting at a wooden spoon on the floor. "I got mean for a while, then I got tired of being mean." Margaret knelt, scooped Hazel gently into her arms, and kissed the child's temple. "You don't carry it like someone mean." "I had to learn how not to. Took time." She looked up at him, her jaw firm. "I'm glad you did." That evening, Asa pulled a bundle from behind the stack of firewood. He set it on the table and began unwrapping it carefully. A worn fiddle, the wood darkened with age, the bow rehaired but clean. "My brother's," he said. "I found it in the loft after the last snow. Thought I'd forgotten how to hold it, but turns out the hands remember." Margaret's eyes widened. "You know how to play." He tucked the fiddle beneath his chin and ran the bow lightly across the strings. A soft, wavering note hummed through the cabin. He adjusted the tension, then began a slow tune, something low and winding, like creek water under ice. Hazel stilled in Margaret's arms, wide-eyed. "I haven't heard music in over a year," Margaret whispered. Asa didn't answer. He played until the fire burned low and Hazel fell asleep, cheek pressed to her mother's collarbone. When the last note faded, he lowered the fiddle and met Margaret's gaze. "I never played for anyone but family." She stepped toward him, voice quiet. "You still are." He looked down at her, the soft lines of her face lit gold by the coals. "I've been thinking," he said, "about your name. What about it? You've been signing the registry at the church as Margaret Murphy." "I didn't want to presume." "You're not presuming, you're my wife." She reached for his hand. "Then I'll take the name proper." "Margaret O'Rourke." He curled his fingers around hers. "It suits you." The snow deepened in the weeks that followed. The days shortened, and Margaret learned to split kindling without bruising her palms. Asa taught her how to load the rifle and where the coyotes liked to track. They butchered a buck together by lantern light, and Hazel teethed on a carved ring Asa shaped from antler. By midwinter, they had settled into something quiet and whole. No declarations passed between them, but their lives had joined in every small way, in the way she poured his coffee before her own, in how he checked the roof twice after a storm so she wouldn't worry, in how Hazel laughed hardest when Asa lifted her into the air and called her his little thistle. One evening, weeks after the last mail arrived across the pass, Asa stepped inside with a weathered envelope in hand. "Came addressed to you," he said. "From Kansas." Margaret took it, brow furrowed. She opened it slowly, eyes scanning the page. After a moment she exhaled. "My sister. She's well, married now. She wrote to ask if I'd ever come east." Asa didn't speak. "I won't," Margaret said, folding the letter carefully. "I've got my place here." He crossed the cabin, took the letter from her hand and set it on the shelf. Then he reached for her, slow and certain, and she stepped into him just as sure. "I want you beside me," he said. "Not just as the mother to Hazel or the keeper of this house. I want you, Margaret, as my own," her voice caught. "You already have me." He kissed her then, without rush, without question, just the truth of it, steady and warm. Hazel stirred in her cradle, then sighed and settled. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, but inside, everything held. By spring, the second room was built. Margaret planted garlic and beets in a tilled patch behind the smokehouse. Asa built Hazel a stool so she could watch her mother cook, and at night he played the fiddle when the child refused to sleep. They never spoke again of what they had survived before each other. It was enough to know they had. Each day was wrapped in work and quiet joy, the kind that did not need naming. They grew old together in that cabin on the edge of Dry Creek, raising a daughter who never doubted her place in the world. And every time Asa played the fiddle or Margaret stitched a new hem, they did it with the knowing that they had found in each other the peace that comes only after the long night has passed.